We've got Battle Mountain, Graeme Obree's story.
Obree?
Battle Mountain.
We're all struggling with that.
It's a documentary about Scottish cyclist Graeme Obree, who is he was the subject of a fiction film about 10 years ago called The Flying Scotsman. Johnny Lee Miller played him, and it was about his fight for the world 1 hour distance record. And he was kind of trying to get this record, and then got it and lost it and got it again. And he was also struggling with bipolar disorder at the same time. And part of the reason that Graeme Obree became famous in the first place is because the bike on which he got the record, which is called Old Faithful, was handmade, and it was partly built out of an old washing machine, or parts that he'd salvaged from an old washing machine. And he became known as the guy who broke a record on a bike made of a washing machine. Now, this documentary picks up 20 years later when Graeme wants to set a new record for human-powered land speed. And it's on another bike of his own design. This bike is a prone bicycle, which I'm not a kind of a cycling expert, but it basically means you're lying down face forward, or rather face down, with your nose about 60 centimetres from the road.
Wow.
And you're pumping your legs back and forth, basically like steam train pistons. It looks terrifying. The bike itself is called the Beastie. And Graeme is someone who's a very inspirational speaker, and here he is kind of talking a little bit about what's driving him to break this record.
I mean, personally speaking, I want to do 100 mile an hour. I want to be the first man to do 100 miles an hour in this thing. I'm thinking, I want to aim. You know, they reckon if you aim to the stars, you get to the moon. I want to aim for the bloody stars and actually get to the stars. Because I'm thinking, if it's humanly, scientifically possible to do 100 miles an hour. So I'm thinking, if it's humanly possible, scientifically, then let's be doing it. That's where your knee goes. So that's going like that. Personally, I'm choosing to lie forwards on it as a prone bike because the shoulders are the widest part of it. If you want something aerodynamic, you want the widest part near the front and then tail off for aerodynamic reasons.
So the film follows this building of the bike, and he uses parts from an old roller skate that he's got lying around. Parts of a saucepan are sawed out and stuck on in various places. While he's doing this, he reflects on at length on a life that can really only be described as tumultuous. You know, he's battled depression, suicide attempts, death of his brother, and a struggle with his own sexuality as well. And he is basically a totally fascinating and inspiring figure. And this is a documentary that very much I don't want to say coasts, but it uses the fascinatingness of its subject and kind of doesn't really add anything more to it. And that was where I kind of feel that, you know, this film doesn't really bring anything more to Graeme's story than maybe a very in-depth interview with him might do, or, you know, a TV programme about what he's done. I think, you know, there's a lot of interesting stuff as well. He reflects on his own, basically he was frozen out of professional competitive cycling because he was getting into it at the height of the doping culture, and he wasn't prepared to dope. And so they basically told him, well, look, you can't do it then. But he couldn't say why. He just had to kind of slink out into the shadows. And he talks very interestingly about the bittersweet feelings that he had when Lance Armstrong was finally banned, because he said, well, you know, finally he feels vindicated for his ethical stance on doping, but he also feels it reminded him that he'd sort of squandered this professional career. And the film kind of taps into quite well this idea of, you know, when you can't do what you want to do and what you're obviously very good at, how does it manifest? And in this case, it manifests in trying to break these records. So as I say, it's a documentary that kind of rides on the coattails of its subject. But I think if you're interested in cycling, that's not really a problem. You know, if the subject is of interest to you, it's worth seeing. What it doesn't have, like the best documentaries have, is that even if you have, you know, you come into the subject completely cold, it doesn't have that reach out and grab you by the collar factor that, you know, you really want these life story movies to have.
So maybe a bit of a missed opportunity?
I think it has a certain homemade feel about it that possibly a more experienced film. I believe this is the director's first feature.
Right.
And, you know, if someone like, you know, Asif Kapadia, you know, this kind of documentary titan who did the Amy Winehouse documentary recently, and Senna, you know, someone who is just a genius at corralling you know, old footage, new interviews, and building up this incredibly coherent, beautifully structured picture of someone's life, you know, you could have possibly had another film like that out of it. You know, but it gets the job done. But it doesn't really get any more than the job done.
Right.